It's your boy Kel Mitchell.
Hey, from the NovaCon, this is Mike.
And this is Kevin.
Hey everybody, this is Nolan North.
This is Kari Payton. And you're listening
to Movers and Shakers.
Movers and Shakers Unlimited.
Yeah.
Next we have Magpie. So Magpie, interesting. A lot of times she's often identified as like Catwoman light. Women out there in the world. Question in the back, yes. All the way in the back. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to ARKHAM FILES, Supervillain Psychosis, Volume 2. I am your moderator, Brandon Troy. I do the YouTube channel Real Film News that deals with film festivals, cons, what have you. We cover it. Also the host and co-creator of the Cox Cable series, Movers and Shakers Unlimited. You can catch it on Cox Cable on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays at 8 o'clock, quick plug. I'm gonna move my way down to my panelists here. I have Julian Lytle. He is the creator of the webcomic Ants. He's also the co-creator of Long Boxes on 22, one of the original amalgamations of comic books, hip hop, pop culture, and he also writes for the entertainment website known as Punch Drunk Critics. Further down, I have Charles Samenow. I don't know if I have any GW folks out here. Yes? Okay, all right, awesome. He is the Associate Director of Medical Student Education and Psychiatry at GW. He was also awarded the American Medical Association Foundation Leadership Award and Caring Educational Excellence Award for his work in substance abuse and addictions. He's the current editor of Sexual Addiction and Compulsivity, the Journal of Treatment and Prevention, and is a member of the Washington, D.C. Physician Health Program. All right, so I don't know if I have any folks here that you guys were with us at ARKHAM FILES last year. Do we have any folks from last year? Awesome. Okay, all right. Well, for our new folks, basically the whole gist is we'll be talking about some villains in Batman's Rogues Gallery, and we'll hypothesize some possibilities of some issues that they have, but with your help and with the help of my panelists here, we'll try to come up with a more definite idea of what their psychosis is. But before we do that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Samenow to just give a brief idea of what goes into providing a diagnosis.
Great, thank you. I'm not going to spend a ton of time. Like most psychiatrists, I'm pretty clueless to the field of comic books and characters, but that's, we have a bad reputation in psychiatry as being a little bit out there, sort of shrinks it takes one to know one, right? But hopefully what I'm going to do is set the framework for how I think about diagnosis very briefly, and then we'll be turning it over to you all. Now, as my bio was given out, I saw a lot of chuckles around my sexual addiction specialty focus. We won't be focusing on that, so disappointments to you all. Although interestingly, there are some correlates, and with my eyes, I look to that. So, and again, since this is rated R, anything goes today. When I think about making a psychiatric diagnosis, we have the big fancy DSM-5 now, which generally gets some boos when I say it. It is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, hence the Bible of psychiatric diagnosis. It has its pros, it has its cons, and we won't get into that today. I tend to strip all that away and think about it based on 4 Ds. When I'm looking at someone and looking at their behavior, the question is, 1, Are they dangerous in some way? And of course, if we think about suicidality or homicidality, is someone a danger to themselves or others? But of course, that by itself can't work. People do dangerous things all the time. We bungee jump, not that that's really dangerous, but we snowboard. We do all sorts of things that put us at risk. And if we were to say every time that we were at danger, you had a mental disorder, probably every single person in this room would qualify as having some form of a mental disorder. So danger by itself doesn't really cut it in terms of saying someone has a disorder. Deviance, if we were to have this bell curve of life and say that somewhere there's a normal, mean, and there's standard deviations, and some people just fall, a few standard deviations away from the mean. They're a little bit weird, they're a little bit wacky, they're a little bit wild. Again, the problem with that is we have lots of eccentric folks out there. We have a lot of folks who we think and claim are normal, and they're really not very normal at all. And so if we try to use some average of what it means to be a normal human being, we get into a lot of trouble. So if we look at deviance, certain things we know. If we look at sexual perpetrators, there are deviant sexual patterns. If we look at the way that individuals deviate in terms of norms, laws, morals in society, that may help us. But of course, sometimes our laws, our morals, and our norms are crazy in and of themselves. So it's hard to set a standard for what is normal, what is not. Distress. When a person comes to my office, generally they're in some form of distress. It's very rare they're like, hey doctor, I just came here to pay you a few $100 to chill, like everything's great. Usually they're in some form of internal distress. Again, the problem with distress is there's a lot of normal circumstances. Our pets die, we're in distress. That's a normal bereavement, that's not a mental disorder. There are many times in life that we are in distress, and of course, again, when we come into conflict with society, sometimes, individuals, we've looked at in history, transgendered individuals, individuals from minority populations, people from the LGBT community, they're in a lot of distress because society is non-accepting, it's homophobic, it's racist, it's xenophobic, and to say that someone's in distress is the basis of a mental disorder, that's a problem as well. So the final thing is then dysfunction. Does it somehow impair their ability to carry out life? Are they missing work, not engaging in social interactions, engaging in relationships? And again, this one is probably the closest to being the most on track, but we all do things at times, party a little too hard at night and come in late, skip a class, come in late to work. We have dysfunction in our life, and it doesn't then mean that we have a mental disorder. So the way that we have to take a look at these things is putting all these 4 Ds together and then making some form of a subjective experience saying, does the person meet the criteria in the DSM? And then in some way, do they deviate from the norms of society, have a danger to self and others, have internal distress, and or some form of dysfunction in their life. And when we can meet all those sort of come together and as a whole, I'll say, okay, this person has a mental disorder, while maybe this person is just a variation on human experience. So, if I didn't confuse you, the point is this is tricky stuff, and the problem is when we get into using just the book and labels and say, okay, I'm going down this set of criteria, ding, 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 ding. If I were to write the next best-selling book, I'd write Everybody's Bipolar, because, you can go down the list, and yeah, I've had times of sleeplessness, irritability, some grandiosity. Oh, there we go, I'm meeting the criteria. But the problem is it has to be put into a much larger context. The reason I give you this is today we're going to be talking about our villains. We're not talking about our heroes. And the question I have for this group is, what makes a villain versus what makes a hero? Because if we were to look at things like antisocial personality disorder, which pretty much all of our villains have, failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, impulsivity, aggressiveness, reckless disregard for the safety or self of others, consistent irresponsibility, lack of remorse. Okay, this sounds like a criminal, but it also sounds a little bit like some of our superheroes, right? So as we think about it, and in particular, narcissistic personality, we think about some of the greatest villains, the greatest superheroes, potentially some political figures. Anyway, the point has grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love, requires excessive admiration, has a very strong sense of entitlement, is exploitative of others, lacks empathy, is often envious of others, and regularly shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. So I think I put these slides up to say, I think all of our villains, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about being a criminal or being a narcissist, because I think all of our villains have aspects of that. What will be more interesting is some of the more deeper, specialized psychopathology that we'll start to discuss with you. I rely on you. I'm a psychiatrist meeting these villains for the first time. You all and this expert panel will fill in the blanks to help make the diagnosis.
All right, awesome. So the first villain that we will be discussing is the Mad Hatter. I know there are a lot of folks out there that may already be familiar, but for those that aren't, typically has normally physically has like a short stature, and he's obsessed with Alice in Wonderland and always uses mind control devices as his MO. But Julian, I mean, based off of what we have seen in pop culture, whether it's with the animated series or elsewhere, what are your thoughts on it? Because from what I know about the character, what comes to mind just at face value is perhaps OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. But I mean, what are your thoughts?
I'm guessing, there's been many variations of the Mad Hatter, even within just the comic continuity, thanks to the nature of DC's reboots over the many years. So you might start out with the beginning, where he's very much just a basic villain that's based on the Mad Hatter from comics. He's a criminal. His shtick is, I'm going to look like, the illustrations from the Lewis Carroll Alice in Wonderland books. And then once you get into the 70s and the 80s, they kind of focus on his need to mind control people and his obsession with young women and girls that look like Alice, and his need to always, attack or kidnap and do things, even sell these girls into sex slavery, depending on the era or years of Mad Hatter. You even got to certain things when you get into the different cartoons and the shows, whereas Gotham, he's preoccupied with his sister and finding his sister and hypnotizing people, and her name is Alice. Or you get to the animated series where basically he liked a woman, and I guess you could use common terms, he was friend zoned, and he took it a little bit to the wrong place, and he kidnapped and captured her. And then they kind of use some of that once you get around to the New 52, and they haven't rebirthed him yet, but then they start pulling out a lot of different things, like he had to take hormones because of his diminutive stature and his issues with being accepted by his friends. And for the most part, they changed it so that like something, whatever with his mental issues, causes him to delve into this world of Alice in Wonderland, and specifically the Mad Hatter. And I guess that's what makes him a pretty interesting foil for Batman. But even though he's not that empathetic to him like he is for some other villains, he just seems to just in the end beat him up and throw him into Arkham again and again for him to constantly break out.
So with all of that, Dr. Samenow, like what are your thoughts on it with that information?
Sure. Well, this is a fascinating guy, because if you look on the surface value, there is definitely an obsessionality. So the DSM defines an obsession as recurrent intrusive thoughts that an individual can't get rid of. And so as you hear the stories, it's hard to say, is this at the level of an obsession? But then as I was looking into some research in the Secret Six, there was a point where he would not eat food unless it had a hat on it. So we're starting to see the dysfunction, right? If you can't eat unless there is a hat on it, that's going to make your eating choices pretty limited. And so that says to me, okay, this is more than just a preoccupation, a thought, or a worry, but it's starting to actually influence the behavior. Now, the interest in young women, that one is interesting too, because it seems like as the different variations of the character has been portrayed, it could be just simply an obsession of Alice, intrusive, obsessive thoughts, which he can't get rid of. Or, there was in the Arkham Asylum, there was a slant towards maybe this is pedophilia. And so the difference between pedophilia and an obsession is, I can't stop thinking about you, versus pedophilia where I have a sexual interest, persistent desires, fantasies, or behaviors around a prepubescent child that is the primary means of sexual arousal. I leave it to you all. You know these stories better than I. But is this someone who is merely obsessed with Alice and young girls, or has it crossed the line into a sexual deviant nature? Finally, one of the more interesting things is the DSM always has you have to rule out certain things. You can't have a mental disorder if there's an underlying medical condition. And so in one of the Reboot series, they talked about how he had taken testosterone because he had hypogonadism. So hypogonadism, basically not having his testicles or not producing enough testosterone. So he got testosterone, and from that was the origins of his psychosis. And in medicine, we actually see this all the time. We've heard of roid rage. Well, it's no different. We can give people testosterone as a supplement to, for medical reasons, and they can get a little loopy on it. Generally not to the point of becoming a supervillain, but the point is that there is a plausible explanation to his psychosis due to the underlying medical treatment. So we would call that a substance-induced psychosis. So those are the things that cross my mind, but I'm curious for you all to start filling in the blanks. What do you know about this character? Where have I gotten it right? Where am I missing the boat? Where have we as a group told the story or missed the story?
Yes, so by all means, if anyone had any further comments that they wanted to address about the Mad Hatter, feel free. Yes?
I think it depends on which version of the Mad Hatter that you're looking at, because I first met him in the animated series, and then I met him again in the Fox show Gotham, so it depends on which version that you're looking at, because in the animated series, it's just a weird obsession with a co-worker, I think, and that drives him to madness because she, as you said, friends with him. And then in the version in Gotham, I feel like it's more of it's incest because they're siblings, and that is creepy as hell. And it's great storytelling. Oh my god, it's so good. And so I think it kind of depends on which version that you're looking at.
Gotcha. Anyone else? Yes.
Most of my experience from Mad Hatters come from the ARKHAM video games, and in those it appears as if the Mad Hatter genuinely believes that the victims he kidnaps are Alice. Like, he genuinely believes that these girls are the original Alice, and in the end he usually ends up killing them, and then just finds another and repeats the cycle.
Okay, that's. I never really got that far in those Arkham games. No, I'm not saying they're not bad. I just didn't get that far to even face him. So it seems like they still fall along into the more post-Crisis New Earth-ish and maybe even partial New 52 era versions of that character, because he does some of the similar things where he falls into this pattern of this girl is Alice. But then I do think it falls into some of the things Charles said in terms of the character, in terms of what is he really into these girls about? What is he really into Alice as much for? The gentleman.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, does it matter what the obsession's about? Because at times it seems like he's obsessed about Alice as a single piece, and at others it's obsessed with the entire Lewis Carroll world that's been created that he has to live in and have everything else be around. So is there a difference between what you're obsessed about, or is it just that you have an obsession?
It doesn't matter. The DSM doesn't distinguish. Now, what we know sort of evolutionarily is obsessions tend to be about things that have meaning to humans. So they tend to be around cleanliness, okay? Because if you think of us evolutionarily, if we weren't living in clean environments, there's disease, plague, infection, we die. There tends to be obsessions about love and romance and sex. So that sort of ties in, but it can be obsessions as long as it is an intrusive belief that the individual cannot get rid of unless acting through a compulsive manner or doing something to block that thought. It's an obsession, and it doesn't matter the content. The interesting thing about the comment, though, that we heard earlier is, where does it cross the line into being a delusion? It's one thing to be obsessed about Alice, but if I start to believe that you're Alice, and you're Alice, and you're Alice, that's false, right? These are false beliefs. So then it becomes a delusion, a fixed false belief, and much more into a psychotic realm. So the question when we hear someone who has these thoughts in their minds, we have to understand, one, is it truthful? Is it real? Is it intrusive? And so we know the quality of it, but also the content of it. And that helps us differentiate between an obsession and a delusion.
All right. Well, just for the purpose of time, we're going to move on to the next villain, but we will have you guys provide input for our next villain that we have. Up next, we have Magpie. So Magpie, it's interesting. A lot of times she's often identified as like Catwoman light. Oftentimes, as a youngster, she was bullied and received like that moniker because she was obsessed with things that are shiny. But another calling card of hers is oftentimes with the things that she steals, she'll replace it with something, a replicant that's booby-trapped of that thing that she stole. But again, just based off of just the basic knowledge that I have of her, because I know for a few of you folks out there that know a lot of the main villains, Magpie, at least for me, I had to look into because she's a little more obscure for me. But just based off of that, I think of like being a kleptomaniac and just being obsessed with just taking things. But what do you think about it, Julian?
Yeah, she is kind of obscure. She's kind of like D-list, but I do find her interesting because I don't think she was really used that well. She's a post-crisis character. Once they changed everything up, she's like the first person Batman and Superman team up to deal with when they decided to make them not friendly. What Brandon said is right. She was kind of picked on. She liked shiny things. Her name is Margaret Pie, so people just called her Magpie. She grew into it. She tried to be around shiny things. She started to think like these things should be mine and not theirs. She started taking things, and then it seems like before they just killed the character, she would be in Arkham and using whatever means necessary to get shiny things. And she's only really been used twice in outside media. Beware the Batman, I think, had a really good take on her. There's Margaret Sorrow, in which has a similar type of origin, but then the doctors tried to use this new technique, I guess, to help cure, and it created two different personalities within her. One was, you could say, normal and doing her job, fit in society, and then the other personality would emerge, and then she would go out and try to go steal things. And then she's also like in the Lego Batman movie for like 5 seconds. And so there is no characterization for her in that movie other than getting punched.
Great. Well, this year we decided to have a woman on our files, and women can be narcissistic, women can be antisocial. There are some pretty wicked women out there in the world, so we have some representation in our asylum here of a woman. What's interesting is I read about her, the diagnosis that I saw constantly come up was kleptomania. And I didn't agree with it. And so that's where I'm going to need the help from you all. So someone with kleptomania, they have an impulse to steal, but they generally steal things that are not of much value to them. They sort of take these things for the sake of taking them, and then they end up with them, and they're like, okay, great, I have these. The excitement, that dopaminergic surge, is around the act of actually taking and stealing. In this case, what I read about Magpie is there's a reason for stealing these objects. There is a true obsession with shiny objects. And again, as I'm looking across my 4Ds, I saw evidence in the asylum, of Living Hell, where she actually trades sex with Doodlebug for a shiny object, okay? So if she starts willing to engage in trading, her body to obtain this object, that starts to show a behavioral change, dysfunction, distress, etc., related to an obsession with a shiny object. And then she uses these shiny objects as part of her power. So I'm curious if others have, contra information to say, well, she's just a kleptomaniac. But I think she's much deeper, her psychopathology, than simply someone who just gets a thrill out of stealing. The other thing that's very interesting about her is this concept of, does she have multiple personalities? So the DSM has now called multiple personality disorder dissociative identity disorder, and I won't go into all the drama behind the changes in the name. But the point is, these individuals have multiple different personalities where each personality does not know of each other, and a person can switch from personality to personality based usually on some kind of emotional response. A laugh, a cry, even a cough can do it. And it's a very quick switch, and not only do these folks have separate alters or personalities, but they can have different vocal intonations, different body posturing and gestures, and even different vital signs. We have videos of folks where you can actually see changes in their heart rate and respiration rates as they switch from personality to personality. As I hear about Magpie, she sounds much more like a criminal than a dissociative identity. That during the day, a presentation of oneself, and then at night, a totally different person. That's a conscious change or a conscious decision. And in fact, many criminals are very charming, very successful. During the day, they interact. You think of the white-collar criminal, very functional in society, can be getting along with people, but then they have this whole secret, darker life. So I didn't see anything to support a multiple personality disorder. But reality check, you all.
Yes.
Well, the interesting thing that I was going to ask, so with this character, for example, there was the possibility of her having been chemically altered as a result of drug therapy. And the previous character, there was a result of them being chemically altered as a result of drug therapy. And so it goes to the idea that chemicals that we take that we think affect our bodies, we've now learned, tell me if I'm wrong, but they also have psychological effects.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And my other part to this character in particular is, you mentioned that there were things that, it sounded like physiological things, that would cause the personalities to switch. Is it possible that it could be an external stimuli like your circadian rhythm, day versus night?
Not typically seen in dissociative identity disorder, but possible. Possible.
All right, and I know I had a question way back here. I wanted to make sure I got you. Did we have a question back there? No? Okay. Yes, sir.
So you're saying she's more like maybe Patrick Bateman?
Oh, the American Psycho?
Yeah.
Possibly.
So she's not, it's a conscious thing. It's something that she get the thrill out of, and maybe she has a deep embedded obsession with more shiny things, but to satisfy that, she makes these conscious behavioral changes to obtain them, which is not necessarily multiple person.
So you are struggling with the age-old question of behavioral health, which is, what is really a choice? What is conscious, what is unconscious? If we are to believe that this character truly has psychopathology, then their brain, the brain neurochemistry, has hijacked the parts of the brain that give reason. So for most of us, we'd be able to be like, oh, there's a nice shiny object, but I got to go to work today, so I'll leave it. Whereas someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, oh, there's a shiny object, and starts walking down the street and can't stop thinking about it. I need that object. I want that object. If I don't have that object, there's an internal sense of angst that isn't relieved until they do something with that object. And so that is a different wiring of the brain. Yes, there's many folks who have, exactly, this obsessive compulsive disorder. Now again, there's obsessive compulsive personality, like being anal, all right? So that's Freudian, it comes from being stuck in the anal phase of control. That's people who are like neat freaks and have to have everything in order, and like if you go into their closets, all their shirts are in a color and all their pants are in color. Actually I'm a little OCPD, but OCD, where you actually cross the line, is you cannot function or you have internal distress because that thing or that object, the need to wash your hands, to not touch things, to disinfect, whatever it may be, it starts to control you. A mantra of psychiatry is, do you control it or does it control you? And if it starts to control you, we start to feel, well, this is a problem.
All right, awesome. Do we have one more question before we move on to our next villain? Yes.
Well, you mentioned that part of her origin story is being bullied a lot as a child. It almost sounds like there's some questions of like external and material validation going on as well, that like if she obtains the shiny object, somehow it will change people's perception of her.
That is a fantastic observation. Now, the DSM doesn't give a shit about it, but
Rated R.
But as a behavioral psychologist or psychiatrist, you're right. That's the stuff of psychotherapy. Like, why is it that this stuff has such meaning to an individual? So the DSM, when we're diagnosing, only says symptoms. It has nothing about etiology. But that's what's so fascinating. When you get to see these characters and the multiple different variations and different stories, you get to not only learn the what, but you get to learn the why. And to me, that's far more interesting. Far more interesting. But I was just called here to make some diagnoses.
All right, so last but not least, the last person we will talk about is Harley Quinn. Okay, so once a promising psychiatrist at Arkham Asylum, after treating the Joker, she became obsessed with him and eventually fell in love with him. She's often portrayed as being obviously off the wall, but also has like a very dynamic and energetic personality and is very unpredictable. I know that there have been arguments about like what issue she has. I know one that comes to mind for me is schizophrenia, but I mean, I know, doctor, that there are so many different variations that come into play when you're talking about that type of diagnosis. But Julian first, share, please.
Okay, all right. Okay, the Harley Quinn debuted in Batman animated series 1992. Joker's new gal to follow him around, give Batman a headache. You find out in the series that she was his doctor. A new young doctor tried to treat him one of the many times he was taken back to Arkham Asylum. But she fell in love with good old Mr. J. She caught the vapors. And she was like, yo, I'm about this life. She helped him escape. She started dressing up like a Harley Quinn because somehow her name just equals the same thing as a Harley Quinn. So she's like, I'm down about it. And she just joined this life of crazy crime. And then you get all these type of interpretations. She was brought into the DC universe. She has this nice, interesting relationship with Poison Ivy that is, her other bae. And she gets into adventures. She breaks up with Mr. J. She comes back to Mr. J. He really doesn't care. He uses her. She tries to make her own relationships and interact with the DC universe. Then, in which they did it with New 52, she did fall in love with him as usual, but then she was also dumped into the same chemicals as he was. And, then you get to where the debate was Joker always bananas or was it the acid? And then you put her through the acid, did the same thing happen to her? She gets superpowers, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there's a lot with Harley Quinn, but that's a quick rundown, and I can give you, the basics to go for the next part.
Great. Well, so this is, a fascinating character and really brings out some interesting stuff from psychiatry. First, I'm going to start with the personality trait, sort of this dependent and histrionic. So the idea of, many of you are probably familiar with the term codependency. Codependency is where two folks they derive their happiness from each other, and so they can get into this real cycle of where they're both have to be miserable at the same time, and it's sort of like the two go down the same path with each other. And this sounds very much like her with the Joker. Her mental state very much relies on her relationship and interactions with the Joker. And then the histrionic personality is someone who dresses or speaks or demonstrates sort of very flashy, needs to be the center of attention. And of course, as we think just about even Harlequin, the name, it makes sense. What's fascinating is the DSM has gotten a lot of criticism for these being gender-biased diagnoses, that these are traits that are normally seen more as feminine. Now again, I'm making generalizations. Generalizations do not apply to specific individuals, but that it's much easier to diagnose a woman with dependent personality traits because of Western culture and the relationship of what is seen as masculine and what is seen as feminine. And again, the same thing with the way folks dress. That, you know, if a woman dresses flamboyantly, it can either be seen as artistic or like a tart. And so the problem is that the DSM has these traits that are biased towards women, and you see that this character is actually adopting, the female character, these traits that are in the DSM. So that interested me in terms of, as these authors were writing, was this a specific move? Was this a gender bias of their own? You know, I don't know who writes these, but it just interested me that the woman character gravitated towards the diagnoses that we know have a gender bias. The other interesting thing about this character really is a diagnosis that I've never made in my life. But I teach my medical students, and I read about it in textbooks. I don't speak French very well, but folie à deux, which is a shared delusional disorder. And what we know is that when individuals become very romantically attached, and one of them is a little off-kilter, that person can also become a little off-kilter, and then together it's like synergy. They together breed this really delusional, crazy world. And this does exist. There are cases of it. It is very rare, but it generally starts with a romantic relationship. And what's interesting here is this doctor-patient, which is an ethical and legal violation, by the way, but synergy that then leads to this world. And then, of course, finally, we have this whole question of the acid, which gets back to the whole thing, which is, what are the origins of this? Any diagnosis is not complete if we don't know if there's an underlying medical, chemical, substance-induced nature to it.
All right. And do we have, yes, we have a question in the back. Yes, all the way in the back, right there.
If you play Arkham Asylum and you collect the audio tapes for Harley Quinn, it sounds like she's convinced, the Joker convinces her that the Batman is the enemy. So I guess I agree with your shared delusion idea that she actually can see through the Joker's eyes what it is, and she, I guess, uses it as, romanticizes it, and, sees it that way.
Okay, yes, wow. Right there. Right there, yeah. No, gentleman here, yes.
You had mentioned at the start that it was just heavy codependence, and like that they had to always kind of be together almost all the times. But there have been multiple stories where, you know, if the Joker gets caught when Harley isn't there, and he's the only one that gets in Arkham, if it was as closely dependent to each other as possible, or as originally described in like the earlier versions, then each time that would happen, Harley would try and break him out every single time so they could be together, or just I think once or twice she ended up getting arrested, so then they could go to Arkham together. But there are also later on storylines where Harley just doesn't. She decides he's in Arkham, I'm going to go have fun. So then there's all the storylines with the team up with Poison Ivy and Black Canary, even when she became kind of a good guy recently, where she's independent in so many easier and more frequent storylines. She has like a kid that he probably knows about, but pretended that he didn't know that she was gone or something. So the question is, how really, like, is there a kind of different level of codependence that can kind of just frequent and just kind of go up and down too, or is it really just inconsistent regardless?
Yeah, doctor?
It's a very, very complex question, and so generally anything goes. Codependency and sort of the cycle of abuse, you know, people can be thick in it, they can have periods out of it. These things wax and they wane. To have a personality disorder, like a dependent personality, it's a persistent chronic state that generally starts in the late teenage, early adult years, and it's persistent and pervasive. But beyond that, the DSM doesn't give much more. It doesn't say, you know, the exact number of days, etc. So so it is believable that the person is not always, interlocked.
Yes, the question, I'm seeing a hand right there, yes.
Kind of on that note with the code of conduct also, there's been kind of a nuance that she could have been kind of created out of like a Stockholm syndrome sort of situation, because with the emotional and physical abuse and that has cured a lot of things, that's why she goes through the periods in the cycle, as you said. Would that also, how would that be pervasive in a long-term effect too?
That's a great question. So with the Stockholm Syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder, so if we think of trauma and that she is someone traumatized, trauma can take a variety of different paths. Many people with trauma do just fine. There's no problems. Then there can be PTSD. There can be borderline personality disorder or even the multiple personality dissociative identity. But in this case, you do make a compelling argument, which is someone who becomes so traumatized they can identify with the aggressor. That's the psychodynamic term. So where we start to admire, adore, take on the characteristic of the person who has been so cruel and hard to us. And then together, that's what is the synergy that causes this folie à deux, the shared delusion. So again, a wonderful psychodynamic explanation, which is etiological, not symptomatic. So the DSM only does the symptoms, but you make a very compelling case for how trauma could lead to this shared delusional state. So bravo.
One last question, because we're really short on time. Yes, right there in the corner.
So in like the Arkham Knight series being Psychosis and also the Suicide Squad, they kind of act like she has two different personalities. You have the Harley personality and you have the Harley personality, and they kind of, she can hear like the voices in her head, and it's like a constant battle. So like, what would that be considered? Like, would that be split personality disorder?
It's a wonderful question. I would probably need a little bit more information. Hearing voices in one's head is always difficult. So we immediately, when we say people are hearing voices in their heads, we think it's auditory hallucinations, and then we go to, well, this person's probably schizophrenic. But in this case, again, I'm not seeing that. To have schizophrenia, you have to have two or more. So you have to not only have the hallucinations, but you also have to have negative symptoms, which I'm not seeing. Flattened affect, isolation, abolition, meaning not doing things. So I don't see that. Disorganized speech, disorganized behavior. There are delusions, so the presence of hallucinations and delusions maybe, but I don't think she's schizophrenic. So then sometimes you can hear voices in complex PTSD, so someone who's been severely traumatized. So I would need to know more, and you're far more an expert than I am. What are these voices telling her? What are they saying?
So like in the Suicide Squad, she's like realizing that she can be a good guy and everything like that, and the Harleen personality starts taking over, and that's like her good side kind of thing. And Harleen wants to do good and be a good person, but it's still struggling with like the Harley persona, because that's all that they want from her is how she is as Harley Quinn and her skill set as Harley Quinn. And in the Arkham games, when you play as her, she's just hearing these voices and she's like, Harley, go back into your box because I don't want to hear it, while she's doing all these bad things. That voice is telling her, don't do it.
Great. So this is partially the classic good and evil, right? The Satan and the angel. So that's partly the good conscience, bad conscience dialogue that they are then bringing out. So again, I can't say that that's the voices of schizophrenia. And again, the voices that you talked about, they don't sound incredibly bizarre to me. We hear folks who have inner dialogues all the time, and they're not schizophrenic. They're, again, based on trauma or excessive anxiety or guilt. So there's a lot of explanations for that before I would jump to that she's psychotic.
Yeah, it sounds to me like a more modern storytelling device, as they try to push her away from just being a villain sidekick into an actual anti-hero, Deadpoolish type icon for their universe, as they push her more heroic in terms of just being a bad guy for Batman, to being like, she might team up with Batman, she might team up with Batgirl, she might do good things so she can be redeemed instead of just being a villain.
All right, so thank you guys so much. I appreciate you guys coming out. Make my way down the table, Julian.
Hey, I also do a podcast. It's called Ignorant Bliss. You can find it on iTunes. I talk to comic creators and I write reviews. at Julian Lytle on Twitter and all the other social media.
Hold on, I'm gonna pause you real quick. We do have some surprise at the end, so I'm just letting you know, if you want to stay seated just for a few minutes, you guys can actually take part in that. But go ahead, Charles.
I don't have much to offer if you need a psychiatrist, I guess. But I'm at GW, this was short this year, but we'll stick around if you have some questions.
All right, and last but not least, again, moderator Brandon Troy. You can find my work on YouTube for real film news, also on Cox Cable with Movers and Shakers Unlimited. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the whole nine. So, surprise. Underneath the chairs, I put a sign that says winner. So if you take a look under your chairs, some of you may have one that says winner on the bottom, and I'll tell you what you earned.
Some of y'all folks that left, y'all lost.
Okay, all right. So we have some t-shirts, some Movers and Shakers Unlimited t-shirts for our folks that have the winner. So come up to the stage, please. Or make your way up to the stage.